The declassified file was buried under layers of redacted government documents, hidden for nearly 50 years. It was labeled Project Enoch, dated 1973. The contents were disturbing. Reports of a remote town, Black Hollow, where an entire cult vanished overnight. What remained was a single survivor, a man driven mad by whatever he had witnessed. The file included transcripts from the interrogation of this man, known only as Jonas Reed, a former theology professor who had disappeared for years before re-emerging in Black Hollow. Agent Keller: Jonas, tell us what happened in the church basement. Jonas Reed: it wasn't a church. Not anymore. Agent Keller: what do you mean? Jonas Reed: we called it the gate. And we opened it. The town had been normal, until the Order of the Black Veil arrived in 1969. They took over the old church, a structure that had stood untouched since the 1800s. Residents spoke of strange rituals at night, guttural chanting, and a low, resonating hum that spread through the air whenever the cult gathered. Then, in October 1973, Black Hollow ceased to exist. The official records claimed an unexplained environmental disaster wiped the town off the map. No bodies were found, just ruins covered in symbols, as if something had burned through reality itself. The only living thing discovered was Jonas, found wandering the woods, his hands covered in symbols etched into his own flesh. Inside the file was a disturbing black and white photograph, the basement of the church, the walls covered in unfamiliar runes. In the center of the image was something wrong, a distortion, a smudge, as if the camera refused to capture whatever had stood there. Jonas had scrawled a final message before his death in the asylum. We thought it was a god. But gods don't whisper in your sleep. They don't call your name from the darkness. The investigation had been buried. But the last page of the report contained a chilling note. The gate remains open. The deeper investigators dug into Project Enoch, the more unsettling the details became. Jonas Reed's ramblings, at first dismissed as delusions, contained eerie accuracy. He spoke of symbols that predated recorded history, chants in a language never identified, and a presence that seeped through the very fabric of reality. The transcripts revealed that Jonas was not just a survivor, he had been one of them. Agent Keller: you participated in the rituals, didn't you? Jonas Reed: you don't understand. We weren't worshipping. We were feeding it. Agent Keller: feeding what, Jonas? Jonas Reed: whispers, the sleeper. It waits beneath. It waits to wake. A secondary report within the file detailed the excavation of Black Hollow's ruins. A team of government researchers had attempted to retrieve artifacts from the church basement in 1981. What they found was worse than empty halls and forgotten relics. According to Dr. Evelyn Park, a leading archaeologist, the walls of the basement still pulsed, as if breathing. The symbols, which should have faded with time, remained fresh. One researcher reported hearing his name called from the darkness. He swore he saw figures standing in the corners of the room, watching. 2 days after the excavation, one of the team members, Dr. Howard Niles, was found dead in his apartment, his body twisted unnaturally, mouth frozen in a silent scream. The cause of death was officially ruled as cardiac arrest, but an anonymous source in the report noted something horrifying. His fingernails were torn off. Scratch marks covered the walls, forming the same symbols found in the church basement. Jonas Reed never revealed the exact nature of what the cult had summoned. But his last recorded statement in the asylum suggested something beyond comprehension. We didn't call it. We merely answered. The final, handwritten note in the file was from an unnamed agent, dated 1996. Black Hollow is abandoned, but the symbols remain. Something watches from the dark. The whispers haven't stopped. In the weeks following the failed excavation, reports from Black Hollow became more disturbing. Locals claimed they saw lights flickering deep within the ruins of the abandoned church. Some even reported hearing low, guttural chants carried by the wind at night. But what truly caught the attention of federal investigators was a missing persons case. April 7, 1982, 3 university students, David Moore, Lisa Carmichael, and Eric Bell, set out to explore Black Hollow as part of a research project on forgotten cults. They never returned. Their last known communication was a cassette tape found inside their abandoned van, parked on the outskirts of town. The tape was badly degraded, but a partial transcript was recovered. Lisa, whispering, "Did you hear that? Someone's walking upstairs." Eric, "There's no one here, Lisa. It's just us." David, "Sure. I hear something. Under the floor. Scraping noises." Lisa, "Oh God. The symbols, they're sudden distortion, unintelligible screaming." End of tape. Authorities searched the ruins but found no sign of the students. Only 3 sets of footprints leading inside, and none coming back out. Jonas Reed, still confined within Rockwood Asylum, was informed of the disappearances. His reaction was recorded. "They didn't disappear." Jonas laughed, shaking his head. "They were taken." When pressed for details, Jonas only whispered, "The sleeper needs more." In a chilling discovery, an unnamed investigator who worked on the case later reported seeing movement in the basement of the church, even though the structure had been condemned and sealed off. When questioned, he simply responded, "Some things don't die. Some things just wait." The Black Hollow case was officially closed in 1983. The ruins were bulldozed, the land declared off-limits. Yet, local reports persist, sightings of shadowy figures near the site, unnatural whispers in the wind, and occasional missing persons with no logical explanation. And then, in 1997, a new document surfaced within the archives. A handwritten note, unsigned, dated 1 year prior. "We tried to bury it. We tried to forget. But the symbols have appeared again, this time in a different town." For over a decade, Black Hollow remained silent. The land was marked as private property, monitored for trespassers, and eventually forgotten by the public. But in 1997, something changed. A local newspaper article from a neighboring town, Briar Glen, caught the attention of an independent investigator, Dr. Alan Graves. The headline read, "Mysterious symbols appear overnight in abandoned warehouse." The accompanying photo showed intricate markings on the floor, identical to those found beneath the Black Hollow Church. Dr. Graves, a former researcher in occult phenomena, recognized the symbols immediately. He had spent years studying the Black Hollow case, collecting redacted government files, and even tracking down former investigators who had mysteriously resigned from their positions. Determined to see the site for himself, Graves traveled to Briar Glen. The warehouse in question had been abandoned for years. Its last known owner had died under unusual circumstances, his body found in a state of extreme emaciation, despite no signs of prolonged starvation. Locals avoided the building, claiming they heard low, rhythmic murmurs coming from inside after dark. Graves entered alone. What he found was far worse than he expected. Deep inside the structure, the symbols weren't just drawn on the floor, they had been carved into the concrete, as if by something impossibly strong. At the center of the markings lay an old wooden box, its lid slightly ajar. The moment Graves touched it, he heard it. A whisper. Not from his surroundings. From inside his own mind. "It sees you now." Graves stumbled backward, his breath shallow. He snapped a single photograph before fleeing the building. That night, he received a phone call from an unknown number. A distorted voice spoke just one sentence. "You should not have come." Graves tried to trace the call, but no record of it existed. The number itself was not connected to any known service provider. The next day, he returned to the warehouse with a police officer. But when they arrived, the symbols were gone. The floor was clean, the wooden box missing. The officer dismissed Graves' claims, but his photograph remained, a single, undeniable piece of evidence. And in the background of the image, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure. It was standing just behind him. Dr. Alan Graves couldn't sleep that night. The image of the shadowy figure in his photograph haunted him. Who, or what, had been standing behind him? Determined to find answers, he sent the image to an expert in photo forensics, a former intelligence analyst named Victor Henshaw. Hours later, Henshaw called him back. His voice was shaken. "Alan, I don't know what you got yourself into, but that figure? It wasn't there when you took the picture." Graves felt a chill crawl up his spine. "What do you mean?" "I ran enhancements, checked for digital manipulation. The metadata confirms it. It's a real photograph. But the figure, it wasn't part of the original shot. It appeared after the image was saved. As if something embedded itself into the file. Graves went cold. Henshaw hesitated before adding, "And there's something else." I isolated the noise in the background. "There's a voice. Low, almost imperceptible." Graves clutched the phone. "What does it say?" Silence. Then Henshaw whispered, "It says your name, Alan." Over and over again. A sharp knock at the door made Graves jump. His apartment was locked, and he wasn't expecting anyone. He hesitated before slowly approaching. The knock came again, louder this time. He peered through the peephole. No one was there. His heart pounded. Taking a deep breath, he unlocked the door and opened it. Nothing. Only the empty hallway. But then, just as he turned to close the door, he saw it. A single black envelope, sitting on his doorstep. Inside was a photograph of himself, taken from behind. In the bottom right corner, written in deep red ink, were 3 words. "You are marked." Dr. Alan Graves stared at the photograph in his trembling hands. His own image, taken from behind, but who had taken it? And the words, "You are marked." A cold dread settled in his stomach. He slammed the door shut, bolted the lock, and pulled the blinds. His breathing was ragged, his heart hammering in his chest. His phone buzzed. Victor Henshaw. "Alan, you need to get out of there." "What? Why?" I ran another analysis. That whispering in the background? I isolated the frequencies, and there's more than just your name. Graves swallowed hard. "What does it say?" "He sees you. He knows. It's too late." A chill crawled up Graves' spine. Victor's voice dropped to a whisper. "I think the cult never stopped, Alan. And I think they know you're getting too close." At that moment, Graves' lights flickered. Then, a single knock at the door. Not 3, not 2. Just 1. Slow. Deliberate. Graves held his breath. He checked the peephole, empty hallway. But something wasn't right. The hallway light outside his apartment wasn't on. It was supposed to be motion activated. Something was standing there. Something the light refused to recognize. Then, the doorknob twisted. Graves stumbled back, heart racing. He grabbed his phone. "Victor, someone's here." Static. Then, a voice, not Victor's. "You shouldn't have looked, Alan." The call ended. And from the other side of the door, a whisper. "We see you now." Dr. Alan Graves couldn't move. Elizabeth stood in the doorway, her silhouette wrong, stretched, her limbs just a little too long, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Alan," she whispered. Her voice echoed inside his skull, a sound not meant for human ears. He tried to step back, but his legs refused to obey. Then, she moved. Not walked. Shifted. One moment she was by the door, the next, right in front of him. Her breath was ice against his skin. "You never should have looked." Her hand shot forward, fingers pressing against his forehead. Alan screamed as memories that weren't his flooded his mind. Rituals in the dark, chanting voices, the feeling of something old and monstrous waking beneath the earth. Then, silence. When Alan opened his eyes, he was back at the institute. His office. Papers neatly stacked. The clock ticking. His desk lamp flickering faintly. Had it all been a dream? He looked down. His hands were shaking. Then, his eyes landed on something that hadn't been there before. A book. A leather-bound tome, old and reeking of age. The title was burned into the cover. The Testament of the First Awakening. His fingers trembled as he reached for it. But before he could touch the cover, a whisper. Right behind him. "It's too late now, Alan." The lights flickered out. And in the darkness, something breathed. Dr. Alan Graves awoke in the void. There was no floor beneath him, yet he wasn't falling. No walls, yet a terrible pressure crushed his chest. He tried to move, but his body was frozen in place, suspended in endless black. Then, a flicker. A shape loomed in the distance. Not a thing, but an absence, a wound in reality. It pulsed, a swirling mass of shadow and hunger. Then, a voice. "You were warned, Alan." His breath caught in his throat. He recognized it. The voice belonged to Dr. Elizabeth Vance, his former colleague. The one who had vanished in this very investigation 10 years ago. "It sees you now." A cold hand pressed against his forehead. Alan's vision split, the void ripped apart, and suddenly, he was back. The apartment. He gasped, his body shuddering violently against the floor. His skin burned with unseen markings, as if something had branded him from the inside out. The room was not the same. The furniture was gone. The walls pulsed as if breathing. And the shadows in the corners were not empty anymore. Something watched. Then, a knock. 3 slow, deliberate raps on the door. Alan turned his head, heart hammering. The door creaked open on its own. And standing there, framed in the dim hallway light, Elizabeth. Except her eyes were black pits. And she was smiling. Dr. Alan Graves couldn't move. Elizabeth stood in the doorway, her silhouette wrong, stretched, her limbs just a little too long, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Alan," she whispered. Her voice echoed inside his skull, a sound not meant for human ears. He tried to step back, but his legs refused to obey. Then, she moved. Not walked. Shifted. One moment she was by the door, the next, right in front of him. Her breath was ice against his skin. "You never should have looked." Her hand shot forward, fingers pressing against his forehead. Alan screamed as memories that weren't his flooded his mind. Rituals in the dark, chanting voices, the feeling of something old and monstrous waking beneath the earth. Then, silence. When Alan opened his eyes, he was back at the institute. His office. Papers neatly stacked. The clock ticking. His desk lamp flickering faintly. Had it all been a dream? He looked down. His hands were shaking. Then, his eyes landed on something that hadn't been there before. A book. A leather-bound tome, old and reeking of age. The title was burned into the cover. The Testament of the First Awakening. His fingers trembled as he reached for it. But before he could touch the cover, a whisper. Right behind him. "It's too late now, Alan." The lights flickered out. And in the darkness, something breathed.